Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. The Lost Penny. Hello there. We've opened our scrapbook tonight to a page that is filled with an amazing story, for it's an unlikely tale of coincidence and the romance of a wandering coin. Moreover, it came out of the happenings of the place in which we live, though the experience of the former resident of the Grace Harbor and ours. And it happened like this. It was during the war years when Grace Harbor was building ships to bridge the Atlantic and to take the war home to the Kaiser that C.F. Luke and his family moved to Aberdeen. They crowded into a thickly populated town that was bulging at the seams from hordes of shipyard workers pouring into it to put up wooden ships together, and their little daughter Mavis enrolled at Franklin School and began to study the 3 R's. Mr. Luke was a shoe repairman by trade, and he found plenty of work in the busy shops of the city putting new soles on old shoes. The family was slow to become acquainted, and their crowded little house wasn't what they had hoped for. Mrs. Luke wasn't well, and she blamed the harbor's climate for her miseries. And long before the war came to an end, the Lukes hoped to move south to California. But in 1918, there were still residents of this community, and Luke worked at his trade while Mavis attended school. And it was about this time that Mrs. Luke gave her daughter a new penny. Now little Mavis was 10 years old in 1918, and a penny had only 2 values to her. It would buy at Mrs. Bryant's green store on Market Street near the Franklin School, and what she could do with it as a plaything. And since it was Saturday, she decided to use it as a plaything. Her mother noted that it was a brand new, marked 1918, and it would be nice for her to keep the pretty little piece of copper. So Mavis set about to make it into a special good luck piece. She took her father's shoemaker's awl, and working diligently bore a hole into the rim of the coin through which she could put a string. It made a bright piece to hang around her neck, and she wore it to school the next Monday. From that day on, she carried it in the pocket of her dress or left it about the house in a place where children leave things, so that they are always being picked up and moved. This particular penny, however, was not easily lost, for it had a bright red string tied around it, and it kept turning up again and again. And one day, with more time on her hands, Mavis scratched her house number under the words that she couldn't understand, but that spelled out E pluribus unum. Then she carried it again for a few days and laid it around from time to time, and finally the penny disappeared. Now, in most stories, that's the end of the penny until years later someone digs it up from under the house and spends it, without knowing where it was spent or where it came from. But not this penny. Its story is just beginning. The shoemaker kept to his vow to leave Grace Harbor when the war was over, and the sudden and complete silence had come over the once bustling shipyards, and the crowds of war workers who had jammed the harbor had drifted away to other spots along the coast. Luke packed up his things and his family and moved south to California. Los Angeles was growing, and they settled not far from the city of sunshine, and the years were ticked off on the table of time, and they almost forgot the place in which they had lived during the frantic war years. Mavis grew to be an attractive young woman and moved with her family to San Pedro. In fact, to 329 13th Street in San Pedro. So much for the Luke family. But what about the penny? Now, to trace a coin from one spot to another is quite a day's work. Government statisticians estimate that coins are handled by as many as 100 people in a single day in a big city. And in its lifetime, a penny may travel millions of miles and go through hundreds of thousands of hands, perhaps the same hands many times, although the hands don't recognize the same penny when it comes back, no more than they might recognize the feel of a particular dollar or one special 50-cent piece. So just how that penny with the hole in its rim and the address scratched under the E pluribus unum got out of the possession of the Luke's daughter and began its peregrination, we can't say. But the memory of the 10-year-old child is keen. And perhaps the more keen is the case, because Mavis had broken the point on her father's shoemaker's awl that Saturday morning when she was working with her new Lincoln penny, and been given a spanking for her troubles. Yes, and even more than that, the broken point of the awl had slipped out and cut her finger painfully, and she carried a tiny scar on the tip of one finger to remind her of her handicraft on that bright 1918 piece of copper. So 7 years passed, and the penny, like the family, can travel a long way in 7 years, and February 1925 came to San Pedro, California. It came bright and almost crisp from Southern California, with the morning of the 9th of February even brighter than the days before it, and that was the morning that Mavis's mother sent her to the store to make a few purchases for lunch. It was also the morning that the fates had combined to work one of those miracle coincidences. Mavis wandered amongst the stocks of the store, making her selections and visiting with the clerks who were friends of hers. And she laid the crisp new bill on the counter to pay for her purchase, and the clerk counted out the change. He dropped a dull brown penny into her hands that looked a little travel-wearied and worn with many handlings. It looked even more than travel-worn. It appeared to have been damaged with an encounter somewhere along the line that had given it a perforation at the rim. And the young woman, as she dropped the change into her coin purse, selected the penny out to examine it. For in 1925, a penny was still a coin of at least minimal value. She noticed that the coin had a puncture hole through it at the rim, and then she noticed a faintly scratched line of childish figures below the inscription E pluribus unum on the copper coin. She didn't recognize them, but some impulse caused her to examine them more closely. They were barely perceptible under the grim wear of 7 years, but she read them unmistakably. It was the address of her wartime home in Aberdeen. The penny had come back to Mavis Luke after 7 years of wandering. The copper coin that the little girl had dangled from a string as she hurried to classes at the old Franklin School building had come back to the young lady of 18 in the store 1,000 miles away, and after a lapse of 7 long years, I don't know what happened to the penny after that. It has been another quarter of a century since Mavis Luke examined that penny in San Pedro, and I suspect that it is long lost again and on its way to new adventures, probably the story that we will never have to go on an adjacent page in our scrapbook. But we thought of the story of Mavis and her penny, which has started its wandering from Aberdeen back in 1918 and deserves a spot in our hometown scrapbook for tonight. And now, here's Dick for a word from our sponsor. Souvenir coins have a fascination for probably everyone, though some of us take them more seriously than others. It's that way with collecting. Some of us have a collecting streak in our system, and there's nothing that we can do except collect something. It's not important what it is. Maybe coins, maybe stamps, others old bottles or cigar bands, matchbooks, carved elephants, miniature bottles, or snuff boxes. It's not important what we collect. But one of the universal items that is collected by people of all languages and all lands is postage stamp. Who Grays Harbor's first stamp collector was, history doesn't record. But amongst the first to go at the business seriously, and the man who has followed the business of stamp collecting through his lifetime, is our neighbor, Louis Kiefer. Most everyone knows Louis. He's a postman with the Aberdeen Postal Service, and certainly he works about as near to his hobby as anyone can. And for more than 30 years, Louis Kiefer has been gleaning old envelopes, wrappings, and packages for an occasional find that brighten the life of a stamp collector. The reason we find Louis Kiefer in our scrapbook this evening is that Louis, probably more than any other Grays Harborite, can claim the title of the harbor's #1 collector. There have been others before him. Certainly there were a few old-timers who carried the collecting of stamps to a pretty professional level before Louis got to it seriously. Vic Street had built a collection containing some very rare stamps before he ever came to Grays Harbor to build the whaling station way back when. But the young collectors of the harbor back in the early teens, Louis Kiefer was the one who epitomized the hobby. Louis lived alone in a small house at the end of Arnold Street, and in the days just following the First World War, it was way out in the woods to most of the community. But like one who built a better mousetrap, the harbor beat a path to Louis's door. For Louis not only collected, he dealt. Even as he does today, he dealt in stamps. And the young collector of the harbor who trudged the steep slopes of the Arnold Street hill and ambled down the other side, clutching their dimes and quarters in sweaty fists, just for the pleasure of picking a few Zanzibar Centennials or a couple of postage-due Brazilians out from a sheath of stamps that Louis had for sale. At that time, when Grays Harbor seemed a long way from the metropolitan center where stamps and coin companies cater to for the hobbyist, Louis Kiefer was the connecting link with the outside world. He had advice and counsel for young collectors, and he was a judge and jury if some young philanthropist thought he had turned up a valuable one. Louis appraised it and said what it should be worth, pouring in wild through his stout collection. And today Louis is one-man philanthropic agency and probably one of the best-known authorities on postage stamps, professionally and amateurly in the Northwest. And many a collection in his possession of some of Grays Harborites trace its origin to the start that Louis gave to their owners back in the teens. And because he is Mr. Philatelic to most of Grays Harbor, he has been, as long as we can remember, person that we find here time for to have a few paragraphs of interest in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.